I'm gonna go around to every big shape and give them an average value, mix the paint, and fill in the shape. I'm going to be looking at the shapes that are, I'm gonna be looking at my shadow shapes separate from my light shapes and making sure that the things in shadow are staying in the shadow range of value and the things in light are staying in the light range of value. And I'm gonna use this guy to hold me accountable. And I'm gonna create a, almost like a value architecture for the painting that will help hold me accountable. I like to start with extremes. I can start in my lights, but I can also start in my shadows. If I start in my shadows, I'm gonna look at my darkest shadow. So I'm gonna squint, look over at my subject, and I'm gonna say, what shape is the darkest value in the shadow? So I'm only looking at these areas of my subject. And what feels darkest to me in shadow is this whole, the cup over here in shadow. So that's gonna be the first shape that I want to define. And I'm gonna call it my darkest shadow. So I'll take my little brush and I'll say, this is my darkest, my DS, my darkest shadow. Where's my lightest shadow? So now I need to go and squint and look, what is the lightest thing in shadow? I think that this is my lightest shadow. This seems, when I look here, if I look here and I try to look at this guy out of the corner of my eye, but I'm looking at my subject, this feels darker than this. So that's how I decide that this is, I'm gonna go ahead and call this my lightest shadow, my LS. So I've got my darkest shadow, I've got my lightest shadow. I've got my two extremes within my shadow, darkest and lightest. And then if I look at everything else, it should be either lighter than, it should be both darker than the lightest shadow and lighter than the darkest. So is this lighter than darkest? Definitely. Is it darker than lightest? I think so. Is this lighter than darkest? Yes. Is it darker than lightest? Yes. And this one feels the same. So I feel good about this. I know what my value structure is in the shadow. So I'll go ahead and label these. I call them middle shadows. This is middle shadow. This is middle shadow. And this is middle shadow. Okay? I don't necessarily haven't applied values to them, but I have given them structure to say darkest, middle, lightest. So now I'm gonna move into the light. I'm gonna do the same thing. Where is my lightest light? And I could say, okay, there's a little highlight right there. That's a detail. So I'm looking for big shapes. Where's my lightest lit shape? This guy's pretty light right here. This is pretty light. It's really screaming out at me. But so is this on average. So if I look here, at my subject, and I try to compare out of the corner of my eye to this part of the bird. Does the bird seem lighter? Maybe. Let me try it. Let me look here, and out of the corner of my eye, I'm gonna look here and see, does this seem lighter or darker? It seems darker. I think this is my lightest. That, you know, going back between these two, this is my lightest. Definitely my lightest light. Now, I might still include this, even though this is a little bit darker than this. I might still include this as the lightest light. I'm not sure yet. I need to look and see what else I have. So I know this is my lightest light. This is part of it. What is my darkest light? Is this? This is in light, it's dark. This guy is in light, it's dark. Is this darker or lighter than this? And do that same thing. I'm gonna look here and look at this out of the corner of my eye. I'm gonna look here and then do the same way and say, which one is lighter or darker? I think this is darker. And I think this is my darkest light. So this whole shape here is my darkest light. Now I have to decide. As I said before, this might be included with my lightest light. This might be included with my darkest light. But I also have to give a middle light. So I've got this whole negative space, which is something we haven't really talked about. But this guy is darker than this and lighter than this. So I'm pretty sure this is going to be a middle light. This guy, this guy. So I feel good that this is middle light, this is lightest light, this is darkest light. And the difference between the darkest light, the middle light, and the lightest light, there's a nice jump. So I'm seeing a pretty big difference between from here to here and then from here to here. Now I have to decide for my lightest lights, I need to decide this guy here and this guy, are they closer in value to the extremes or to the middle? So is this closer in value to my middle light, or is it closer in value to my darkest light? Now, if I go compare, I'm gonna look back and forth, and I'm gonna notice that it is closer in value to my darkest light. So I'm now gonna just average this as part of my darkest light, even though I know it's lighter than this, but I'm trying to simplify and create a 6 value structure. So this is a dark light. Now I have to compare the lightness in this book. Is it closer in value to my middle light or my lightest light? Definitely the lightest light when I look at that. So I'm gonna call this a lightest light. Now, I broke this book down, and when I talk about this, I'm actually including this whole section. But I think that there's this whole part as well, and I kind of include this part of the light with this part of the light. But it's a separate shape. This part is darker than this. So now I have to decide, like, is this also lightest light, or is this getting dark enough that it's middle light? And so now I need to go compare this to my middle light. And then I need to compare it to my light light and decide, what is it closer to? Is it closer to my light light or my middle light? And honestly, I'm looking over there and I don't think it's either. I think it's kind of like right smack dab in the middle of my lightest light and my middle light. And I know that if I keep this lightest light and this lighter than this is gonna help this be more prominent in the painting. So I'm gonna strategically say, I'm gonna make this middle light. And that's this whole shape here is all middle light. So I have a value structure in my shadows and in my lights. I know what everything is relative to each other.
So I'm going to assign values to each level in the hierarchy, and I want to make sure that each level works relative to the other levels. So I will, and what I mean by that is if I give my darkest shadow, say I give it a level 9, then when I go and look at my lightest shadow, say I gave it a value 7 for my lightest, is the relative difference between those two the same as what I'm seeing? So I'm gonna write my whole value hierarchy on the side. I've got, I'll start with lightest light, middle light, darkest light, lightest shadow, middle shadow, and darkest shadow. I'm going to give each of these a value number. Something that I want to talk about before I get into this is that when darkest light and lightest shadow are equal, same value, that actually can work out really nicely. It doesn't have to be true, because sometimes your lightest shadow may be lighter than your darkest light. But if that's going to happen, you need to recognize that it could be an issue when you start painting, and you may decide, even if you're seeing the lightest shadow is lighter than the darkest light, that maybe you make the decision to make them equal so that the painting reads accurately. I don't want my values to be exactly the value that's over there per se. More than that, it's important that my values are accurate relative to each other, and that when I compare the value of one shape to the value of another shape, that is all holding true. So I do this analysis at this point, and then I check myself when I start painting and see if it works. And if it does, then I can move forward with full confidence that I've got accurate values, and that as long as I hold true to those values, my painting's going to work. I'm making it easier. I mean, I'm doing this step, and it kind of feels sometimes analytical, but it helps to make your future self, it makes it easier. You can be more expressive. You can let loose knowing that things are going to work. So let's go ahead and do it. So I'm going to start, again, I like to start with my extremes. So I've got my darkest shadow. I'm going to start with my darkest shadow. And I'm going to hold up my value card. I actually want to get it in the same light as my painting. If I stand too far away, or the lighting is too different, I won't be able to see my values quite accurately. So my darkest shadow is definitely feeling pretty dark. I mean, it's a pretty dark thing, and it's wanting to be in the pure black range, and which would be a value 10 on my card. But I'm going to make a decision not to make it a value 10, because I reserve my darkest for the very end. So I might end up ultimately having it be a value 10, but I'm going to start by saying I'm going to make it a value 9 and allow myself to push it darker later. And so that is the darkest thing in my paint. The very darkest thing is going to be a value 9. Nothing should go darker than that. So let me put value 9. Now I could start filling some stuff in, but I want to go through this process first to show you where I'm headed and then adjust. Because sometimes you get to the end and then you realize, you know what, I need to make something different. So I'm going to go ahead and go through. I'm going to do my lightest shadow now. Where are my lightest shadows? My lightest shadow, I said, was this guy. This is the only thing. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to hold my value card up, and I'm going to make sure it's in the light. And I'm seeing it at about a value 5, I want to say. I'm squinting and that line is disappearing. So it's a value 5. And now I know that my middle shadow has to be somewhere in between. Now, I could take the easy route and I could actually just make it a value 7, like halfway. And there's nothing wrong with that, because the thing about these values is I have this middle shadow, I have this middle shadow. These are different. This is a middle shadow. These are all going to be different values, but I'm limiting myself to giving it one value to simplify. And when I move on beyond this step, I'm going to allow myself to push dark, subtle value shifts, darker and lighter, into these different areas of paint. So I could make it a value 7, and even if, say, this is a value 8, and this is a value 7, and this is a value 7.5, I'm going to start to push those adjustments in. But what I want to do is know that these need to be kind of close to each other, but different enough from the lightest shadow and dark shadow. So 7 is right in the middle. I'll just for fun, I'll go and test it and see, do these look like value 7s? The cast shadow on the book seems like a value 6 to me. The shadow on the cup seems like it's a value 8 or 9. I mean, it's pretty dark, more like a value 8. And on the bird, it seems like it's a value 8. I know this is going to be a little bit darker than these two, but I'm going to let it be a 7 for now, because I want it to be that much different from the darkest and the lightest. Now let me move into the light. I'm going to start with my lightest light, my extreme. And I said that this and this, these two shapes were my lightest lights. So let me see what I want to call those. Those feel like they're they're a little bit lighter than a value 1. So I'm going to give them a value 1. Now my darkest light is going to be a little bit of a challenge because it's a really dark object in the light. Now, what's going to make this feel like it's light is going to be the relationship of it to the other planes on it. So it might be a lit shape that is darker than the lightest shadow. And we will figure that out by comparing it to, where are my lightest shadows? The lightest shadow is here. We will figure out how it compares relative to my lightest shadow. Is it darker than that, or is it the same? Now, if it's the same, then we know that we're in good shape in terms of creating an image that's going to read. But we do want to make sure that it's going to read as a dark object in the light. There is no right answer when it comes to this kind of stuff, and this is where values tend to get tricky. I don't want to create the idea that this is in shadow, or confusion that this is in shadow. If this starts to feel like it's in shadow, then we have a problem. Same here. If I make this too dark, it could make it seem that this lightest shadow is in the light. I don't want that either. So we just have to pay attention and check these things as we go. Now that we've had that discussion, let's talk about what we think the darkest light is. So if I had my lightest shadow as a 5, so it could be a 5, but let me see. Is it a 5 or is it darker than that? And I am seeing it as a very clear value 6. Maybe even inching into the 7 territory, but I think 6 is probably right. So that's what I'm seeing. I'm gonna call this a 6. And let me go back to that lightest shadow and see, is that really a 5? I gave it a 5, but it could be a 6. So I think I might actually change my lightest shadow to be a 6. And then these guys are equal. I've got my 9, my 7, my 6. I still feel okay about my middle shadow. It might end up going darker in some places to be in between, but we'll try a 7. We've got a 1 for my lightest light, a 6 for my darkest light. So my middle light, this is the only one I haven't done. There's a big wide range between 1 and 6. So there's a wide range of what that middle light could be. I have this, and this as my middle light. So let me see what I think that those are. Because I could just pick a point in the middle, say, oh, well, it's a 3 or a 4, but let me see what it's closest to. Yeah, so it seems to me like it's closer to a value 4. It's not, though the background is. And then the book part is closer to a value 2 or 3. So how about I give it a 3, just split the difference. So it'll be a 3 here and a 3 here. But then as I'm adjusting it beyond that, then I can push this a little bit darker and this a little bit lighter as I need. But this will be what I average it to. So I've got 1, 3, 6, 6, 7, 9 are the values that I am going to be using. I want to be in the ballpark when I start, and I want the value hierarchy to be clear. I want to know that everything relative to everything else is working. And I'm going to start putting paint up on the canvas, and I'll see if it's working immediately as I compare one thing to another.